Thank you. I have to remember to unmute myself. But yes, I hope you enjoyed seeing that the video again. I I'm sure you can understand why. As soon as I saw a rough cut of it, I realized it was something that we should really share and talk about together as a community. So it is really a pleasure to introduce my fellow Raven, William Price III, to all of you. If you're unfamiliar with the Raven Foundation, really briefly, we share the nonviolent reading of scripture and theology made possible by mimetic theory through our blogs, podcasts, and now through video, which has become a big part of our outreach to those who've been wounded by exclusionary and judgmental Christianity. So Billy is a screenwriter, director, actor, and creative director, and he conceived, wrote, produced, directed, and edited the two films we're engaging with tonight. I asked Billy to tell you about his concepts for the video and his approach to sharing mimetic theory through the arts. So Billy, I'm going to hand it to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think my remarks will be fairly extemporaneous and personal. And I think I could sum them all up with one word, which is gratitude. Discovering René Girard's thinking about mimetic theory, violence, sacrifice, good violence has been a discovery that has unfolded over the years and continued to bear fruit and to provide me with a great deal of hope. I think it's very funny when people talk about René as somewhat pessimistic because he likes to talk about the apocalypse, because everything that he had to say strikes me as a gift of hope. And I find the work of entering into mimetic theory and seeing ourselves in mimetic theory and seeing our communities through this lens to be an incredible opportunity for peace in the world. I've always been really dissatisfied and bothered by those who revel in violence, whether they revel in violence because they're the quote unquote bad guys, or because it's a video game, or because it's good violence and God told the Israelites to do it. It has never sat well with me. And Girard has given an incredible insight and discipline and language for me to start to understand maybe what's really going on here. And maybe I'm just confirming my own biases, but as I pull that thread, I find more and more hope in that the things that actually, the dynamics at play that actually lend to this human propensity to violence are actually good things, and that could we apprehend them better, could we understand them better, they are the very tools that could lead us to deeper understanding, peace, and love. And so to work on films that expand on these ideas, explore these ideas, and introduce people to these ideas is an experience of gratitude. It's an experience of great responsibility. I take it very seriously that what we are talking about is of dire importance and urgency, that it's a global story, that it's not satisfactory to see it as an academic or European or Christian or white or male enterprise, but that this is something that will require the insights of many people around the world and a great deal of collaboration. So making these has been so joyful because it's been an experience of collaboration. Working with Ariel Clark, who's the choreographer and dancer you're going to see later tonight, was completely a collaboration. There's not a single movement she makes with her body that did not come from her and through conversation with me and her about mimetic theory. Our DP, who just lends these pieces so beautifully, was deeply invested. Another Raven filmmaker, Samuel Sorich, was on set for all of it and was instrumental in helping me to draft and compose and edit these projects. And So I'm so grateful to be showing them. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do this. And I'm hopeful that what we are doing is just the very beginning, the very tip of the iceberg in terms of taking something that has been poured over for good reason in very thoughtful academic circles and beginning to crack it open for those who may not have an entry point so far. And I'm hopeful that film is a good medium for that. I believe it is a good medium for that. I think that the grammar and language of film lends itself to philosophy and to thoughtfulness and to the human experience, but also to an embodied experience, an emotional experience, and even a transcendent and spiritual experience. And so I think that it's very helpful to see video explainers, but I think that there's a lot available in developing a new sort of approach from taking filmmaking to mimetic theory, but also from taking mimetic theory to film. A lot of modern filmmaking follows a mythical sort of structure. And so to start to sort of implicitly critique that and to develop that is actually really exciting. And I feel arrogant to even hint at the idea that I would be critiquing, many of the greatest, great films that have ever been made that are mythological. But I do think that we as people who have been gifted with mimetic theory have something to offer to the film world in terms of understanding human story and human development and desire, especially. So I feel like we're setting off on an adventure. I've been working on these really hard, and I'm ready for a little bit of a rest, and I'm happy to be celebrating the release tonight. But I also feel like we've just begun, and we have so much more that we can do in telling stories, in expounding on ideas, and using film and art to open up and touch upon all the different facets of mimetic theory. And I believe that as we do that, and as we learn and get better at that, it will only become more and more resonant to an audience who's hungry to learn about the alternative to desire run rampant, and the alternative to essentially combative and conflictual feeling and thinking, and desires a world at peace and in mutual appreciation and collaboration. So that's my hope. And these two videos are my very humble offering to begin that pathway. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy. And I'm wondering if you could just share sort of your overall concept, because you came up with a 4-video plan, right, for this sort of mimetic invitation concept. And if you could just take a few minutes to explain that concept of why
Sure.
invitation, why 4, what are the 4 videos about?
Sure. I have seen some explainer, infographic and video type things, and I felt like they're satisfactory, but not very exciting to me. And I didn't want to do another one because I think they're good, the ones that exist, but also because I was like, even if I were to marginally improve on them, which I don't know if I would, I don't see a multiplication of potential impact. And so I started to sort of think about that from a mimetic standpoint. Like I took a mimetic viewpoint and I started to think of explanation is essentially fairly didactic. And I would rather expose someone to mimetic theory through a format that's more essentially collaborative. Film is at its best when it is in conversation with the audience. And that's probably a whole other conversation about what does that even mean, that could have an hour and a half or more. But I believe that film is at its best when it's not, as an art form especially, not necessarily as pure entertainment, but as an art form, when it's not simply forcing feelings and thoughts onto an audience, but is creating a sort of field for that person to exist within. And when it's finished, perhaps you have one person say, well, I thought this person was terrible. And the other person say, oh, no, they were really good intention, and you have these different reactions and things. So the 4-part concept to start exploring that was based on, we do have to transmit some ideas. And so how do we disassemble and break down those ideas? And as, often is talked about, there's the sort of nuts and bolts of mimetic theory as a behavior system. There's the scapegoat mechanism. And then there's, sort of, you could potentially talk about the reversal of mythical and sacred, storytelling that we see in the Judeo-Christian perspective. We could talk about apocalyptic thinking. There's, we haven't even actually decided where the 4th video wants to go, but we knew we definitely wanted to focus an audience in on mimetic dynamics and on a scapegoat dynamic. And it felt right to have a first video that is more heavy on language and starts to actually specifically point out these ideas and to hopefully communicate some urgency, some relevance. Why now? Why should I care? What can this change? What impact could it have? These are questions that are always being implicitly asked in a environment like social media where content is constantly coming. And so there's a lot to listen to and there's a lot to ignore. And I felt that for this, it was important that we stake our claim as worthy of attention immediately. And so it felt right to sort of speak to the audience, to sort of pull them in close enough to the idea, to give them some language, and to explain this is why it matters. And then from there, I think we can set out on more open-ended pieces of art that explore and invite an audience to react to with a little bit of a common set of knowledge and language. Not nearly as much as you would get from reading a Girard book or from, studying it for years, in an academic setting, but just something, So hopefully that's going to be a good structure. And I'm really excited when they all get to sit together as a 4-part, you can watch them episodically. I think that will be really great, and we'll work towards that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that approach very much. And it's the whole idea that the form that we're using is just in and of itself quite beautiful and engaging. And so, we're always thinking about how to go viral, how do you create something that is beautiful and exciting enough that people want to share it. And I think you did. And when they see the dance video tonight, they'll really, really appreciate that. So I want to thanks for the film and for making some comments. And please, as you're thinking of questions for Billy that we can bring to him later on, be putting your comments in the Q&A, and we'll come back to Billy at the end of the evening. Because right now I'd like to introduce Kevin Miller. It's a real pleasure to welcome Kevin to the conversation. He's quite talented, multi-dimensional kind of guy who's written novels and nonfiction books and comic books, but he's also a filmmaker. He's written and directed feature films and documentaries. Some of you who are friends of Raven will know that Kevin won the Raven Award in 2012, the Raven Award for Excellence in Arts and Entertainment, for his documentary Hellbound on Universal Salvation. And he has a new documentary this year that just came out right as COVID was hitting. Bummer, but now is widely available. It's JES USA, where Kevin seeks to untangle American Christianity from militant patriotism, and is greatly helped by reading scripture and Christian history through a mimetic lens. So I asked Kevin, as a filmmaker, to come and talk to us about how film as an art form is well suited to creating an invitation to audiences to engage with the subject of the film. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Great, thanks. And I'm starting my timer because I love the sound of my own voice, so I'm going to make sure I cut myself off. So if you hear the red alert from Star Trek, you'll know I'm 30 seconds away. But first of all, I want to say thank you so much to Suzanne and Keith, Ross and Raven for just their support over the years. It's hard to believe it's getting close to a decade that we've known each other, but I'm very thankful for them. And Billy, I also want to say congratulations on the release of these films. I've been involved in premieres of my work before, so I know kind of the double-edged sword of that experience. It can be unnerving, but also exciting. And I want to say to everybody who just saw the films for the first time, I encourage you to watch them online. Nothing drives me crazier than bad audio, and I think Zoom has really compressed the audio, so you're not really getting the full experience. I think that's really going to hit you in the dance film, but I would encourage you to watch them online afterwards to get the full experience of the films. So I want to talk to you just quickly about story as well as film. So I've been a filmmaker and an author for over 2 decades, and but I still primarily view myself as a writer. That's what I started out doing, and that's, you know, film kind of just became a way of doing that. And for pretty much as long as I've been a writer, I've also taught creative writing and screenwriting in particular. And it's kind of fun and fascinating to teach about something that you do for a living, because it forces you to, you know, just ask some really fundamental questions about what it is that you do and why. And so when I first began teaching about writing, I asked myself 3 main questions. Number one, what are stories? What function do they serve? And what do all great stories have in common? Now, I think there's 2 schools of thought on this. The first is that this idea that all stories are like snowflakes. They're all completely different, and that's what makes them great, is that they're all absolutely unique and totally unlike any other story in the world. The second theory is that, yes, stories are like snowflakes, but in the sense that they all share the same fundamental elements. You probably grew up learning that no 2 snowflakes are alike, which is true on the surface, but at a structural level, all snowflakes are completely symmetrical, and all snowflakes have 6 arms or points because of the way water molecules bond together. So snowflakes on the surface are very different, but structurally they're all the same. And I definitely fall into this latter group when it comes to understanding stories and what makes stories great. I think that the best stories all are great because they coalesce around the same structures, the same basic shapes. And I think that they do this out of necessity rather than choice on the part of the author. I think that no matter what story you're writing, eventually the story itself will shepherd you in a certain direction because of the nature of what a story is. So that idea of form follows function. So the function of a story ultimately dictates the form a story takes. And you know, I came to this conclusion after thinking about the work of people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and all these guys who are, you know, recognizing these universal archetypes that you see across cultures and across time. You know, things like the hero's journey that you've probably heard about, the hero with 1,000 faces. And what that tells me is that if cultures, very different cultures from around the world, are all, you know, kind of like iron filings to a magnet, they're all finding the same structures. What's driving storytelling is not something in the environment; it's something that's inside of human beings. So that is coming out. It's that the environment will have a very minimal influence on the surface of the stories, but structurally it's something coming from inside. So if we think about what stories are, what is their function? What are stories doing for us? We've been telling stories from, you know, the beginning of humankind, and every year we spend billions of dollars creating films and TV shows and hundreds of hours binge watching them on Netflix. So when I tried to think about really what is a story and what is it doing, I reflected on the 3-act structure. I spent a lot of time as a screenwriter, and that just is hammered into you. Structure, structure, structure. You got to have 3 acts, and everything's got to happen by page 10. And if this doesn't happen by page 25, and it's very rigidly structured. But why is that? Why do stories, for instance, have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Why don't they have just a beginning and an end? What about that awful middle, which everyone hates to write, which is the longest part of a story? It may seem like a simple question, but it's not a simplistic question. But when I thought about the 3-act structure, um, I thought about something else that has 3 parts, and that is a debate. A debate or an argument is going to involve 3 things. It's going to involve a thesis, it's going to involve an antithesis, and it's going to arrive at some form of a synthesis. So that roughly correlates to Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. If you think about the characters in a story, you have a protagonist, and his or her supporting cast. They represent a thesis, which is a statement of belief. They encounter an antagonist who has a very different belief. They wrestle, they engage in conflict, and eventually the story arrives at some form of a thesis. Now, we tend to think that the good guy defeats the bad guy and everyone's happy, but I think the best stories are when the protagonist comes to recognize that the antagonist isn't just somebody that they are to defeat. Actually, the antagonist, one of their greatest roles is as teacher. And so rather than negate what the antagonist has to offer, the best thing that a protagonist can do is come to understand what they're missing, and to learn from that and to incorporate it into their point of view. So what a story ends up in is some kind of a conclusion that nobody, ideally not even the author, anticipated, because the act of creating the story itself is a journey of discovery. So the key point here, and this gets us to, I think, where mimetic theory is so helpful to understanding story, is that the thesis and the antithesis both represent 2 parts of the truth. And so therefore the protagonist and the antagonist are both unwilling to surrender, because both of them have latched onto a part of the truth. So why should they have to surrender it? But they've also both made the same mistake, is that they've taken part of the truth and mistaken it for the whole truth. And so therefore they're trying to negate the other person. And that's why, in a story, a character's got to be beaten and broken down to the point where they finally come to the end of themselves, and for a brief moment in time they become teachable. They realize that they don't have all the answers. They all along only had part of the answer, and in fact the part that they really need the most may actually be from the person that they least want to learn from. So in this battle to win out, you'll see the protagonist and the antagonist, as they move forward into the depths of the film, they become increasingly similar till they both reach the point essentially where they're willing to take life or surrender their life for the sake of a partial truth, rather than submit to the lesson that the story is trying to teach them. And it happens over and over and over again. I know, Billy, you said stories of a mythic structure, but I think stories inherently have a mimetic structure. And I think that one of the tools we can do is to help people see that, to see that mimetic structure that is a natural thing happening in the machinery of story. And then how does that relate to conflicts that we see in the rest of the world? So again, going back to the analogy of snowflakes, each story is going to appear very different on the surface. The Avengers is going to look very different from Anne of Green Gables, which is going to look very different from the TV show Mr. Robot, which I recommend you all watch. On the surface, they're going to look very different, but what's going on under the surface is the same. So ultimately, a story becomes a debate or an argument about what is the best way to live. We tend to argue about a pretty short list of things. I've broken it down to love, justice, freedom, and truth. And I could in another time tell you why I break it down to those 4 things, but that tends to be what we argue about the most. And so to get to the key point here, though, is if stories are just arguments, why do we need stories? Why aren't we packing theaters every weekend to watch people debate? Why aren't people binge watching debates on Netflix? Well, because humans don't respond very well to bald propositions. In fact, we have an entire defense structure built up to prevent any new presuppositions from entering our brain. We are ready to ignore, minimize, diffuse, and destroy arguments that come against something that we already believe. We also tend to believe a lie about ourselves. We think that we're all rational beings, with the word rational defined as something akin to Mr. Spock's cold, objective logic. We think that we've arrived at our beliefs through this objective reasoning process. But the truth is, none of us have arrived at our core beliefs at this fashion, which is why we become so passionate when we're threatened. When those beliefs are threatened, we arrive at our beliefs via an emotional path, through some sort of emotional experience that makes us susceptible to a change. As Pascal said, the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. So if we arrived at our beliefs via an emotional path, what is the way out? Oh man, I'm already at Star Trek here. Um, uh, uh, i- if we came into our beliefs on an emotional path, well, the way out is going to be through an emotional journey as well. And this is why I think stories are so powerful. Stories are full of propositions, but those propositions are always wrapped in emotional experiences. And so it's almost like a Trojan horse. It's a way of bypassing our logical defenses and planting ideas in our mind. So I'm going to just skip ahead to the end. Uh, this brings up one key question, though: is our stories merely a form of propaganda? Because what does propaganda attempt to do? It attempts to wrap a proposition in an emotional package to make us be afraid, to somehow control us. But I think the difference between art and propaganda is that propaganda presupposes its conclusions, and propaganda gains its power by suppressing alternative narratives. Art, on the other hand, stories, are a journey of discovery. I've just completed my 5th novel, and I always begin a novel with an outline, but there's always a stage in the process where I kind of let the characters take over, because I always say they have better ideas than I do, and I take on the role of transcriber and recorder of what they're doing. And eventually, the story will reach a conclusion, and I can almost walk away from it, almost like, I don't even know how it happened, but we got there. And so I think that the story should be a journey of discovery for the writer as much as it is for the viewer, and as much as it is for the characters in the story. And that's what separates it from propaganda, is that it begins with some ideas, but those ideas are held loosely, and you almost leave it up to the story to help you understand the truth that the story contains. And so that kind of gets with what Billy is trying to do in his films, and what he talked about is inviting the audience on a journey of discovery, engaging them in conversation, and and seeing where it goes. So it's a much more open-ended thing that gains power by exploring the counter narratives, not by hiding from them. And that's why you need in Act 2 to go so deep into the antithesis that there's a danger that the protagonist may go the way of the dark side, but something ultimately pulls them back. But when they do finally make that choice, we know it's a real choice, because we knew that they could have gone another way. And so I'm excited about what you're trying to do in terms of looking to these types of mediums, because I think that there's a natural fit with mimetic theory. And I think it's actually quite astounding. And that's one of the things that makes mimetic theory so powerful to me, is looking at story after story and just seeing that machinery at the heart of the conflict that makes the piece of art so compelling. So sorry, I went over by about 3 or 4 minutes there, but
No, that's okay. It really fascinating. I actually just feel like I need to ask Billy if he wants to respond in any way, because you were just pointing out some wonderful ways in which story can overcome that. You're talking about that resistance to change that happens in story, but that we all have when, as you say, when something propositional comes at us. Billy, did you want to say anything? I want to give you a chance to respond.
Gosh, I feel like if I do, I might open a wormhole for us, because I think
We'll take a small
I have a
one.
feeling Kevin and I could probably go around and around on this all night. I think I agree. I think that there's maybe one way I would say it is that in a lot of the stories that seem to embrace violence as a solution, for example, that there is a mimetic structure at play, and there also is a sacred mythological structure at play. And I think that there's a misapprehension at play as well, or an unconsciousness, and a desire to see an easier solution, and rather than an incorporation of the sort of antithesis that the villain provides, it's an eradication. And so I think that the best stories that are sort of your hero's journey kind of stories, the ones that speak to me the most, where violence does play out in the third act, are the ones where it's tragic. even if the villain is the one who's getting the comeuppance, there's a sorrow or a sadness or a wounding there. The idea that because the bad guy is the bad guy and the good guy kills them or, you know, eradicates them in some way, that they get to go off, the good guy gets to go off into peace and goodness with no personal wounding, you know, no moral personal wounding. I think that's deeply dishonest. And so I love everything Kevin's saying. And I think we're coming in to the same thing from different angles, which creates interesting refinement, you know, and I find myself wanting to adjust what I've said based on what he's saying, but I don't want to disagree. I think there's so much to explore and so much to open up. Yeah, I'm really grateful for those remarks. I'm going to be thinking about them for a while. So, yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I love listening to filmmakers talk. It's always fascinating to me. But thank you both. I'm going to move us along a little bit, and we can maybe come back to some of these ideas at the end. Excuse me, because it's time to watch Dance Mimetic. It's not that, you know, when we're watching it through Zoom, as Kevin says, it's not ideal, and Billy takes a lot of pride in not just the artistry, but the technical aspects of the film. So I apologize to you, Billy, that it's not going to be the ideal watching format, but I do think people will get the main idea of what you were trying to do here. And so I think, Joe, if you're ready, we can all watch Dance Mimetic together.